My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. SpongeBob was a real staple of the video game industry up until about the PS3 era, where licensed games really started to disappear. However, the SpongeBob games I've covered so far really aren't the style of game that SpongeBob fans remember. No, what we all think of when we hear the term SpongeBob video game is something in the vein of Battle For Bikini Bottom. Well, that style of game all sort of started with Revenge of the Flying Dutchman. Released on November 21 for the PS2 and December 18 for the GameCube, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman also received a GBA version, as was pretty much customary for this entire generation. The GBA version actually released first, hitting shelves on September 10. This handheld release was developed by Vicarious Visions. They developed Super Sponge, the very first SpongeBob game, and had also developed the Wild Thornberrys Rambler. Eventually, they'd make codename Kids Next Door Operation Soda, before working on handheld ports of Activision games and Marvel and Disney titles, before eventually becoming the Skylanders and Remakes studio. The developer of SpongeBob's first ever 3D game on home consoles was Big Sky Interactive, who we encountered very recently with Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. In that video, I alluded to Big Sky having an interesting story surrounding their very brief lifespan. Literally the only two games they ever released were these two Nick games. I'm going to give you a summary of what happened, but if you want a complete look at their history, check out this video by Who Needs Normal. I'll include a link in the description. Big Sky first landed the contract for developing Revenge of the Flying Dutchman by going to some pretty extreme lengths. THQ, the game's publisher, were taking pitches from dev studios, and while most other studios were doing standard pitches of concepts and rough ideas, Big Sky decided to just make the damn game. In 2 weeks, they created an entire functional level to really show THQ what they could do with the SpongeBob license. Big Sky quickly won the contract and set out to make Revenge of the Flying Dutchman alongside Jimmy Neutron. Both of these games were being developed on a proprietary engine created by Big Sky's parent company, Callisto. Unfortunately, this engine was causing major headaches for both SpongeBob and Jimmy Neutron, mostly because it wasn't designed to handle many of the features they wanted to include in their games. At the same time, Callisto hit major financial troubles, directly leading to them shutting down in April of 2002. To keep things afloat, a handful of studio leaders took the remnants of the studio making the two Nick games and founded a new studio. This is where they started going by the Big Sky name. At this newly formed studio, they essentially remixed Callisto's engine, adapting it so it could hopefully run their titles and bring to life their ideas. THQ was said to be very understanding of this turbulent patch for Big Sky. After all, it wasn't their fault that their parent company had exploded, and it was far too late in development to switch studios anyway. But the relationship with THQ was incredibly rocky. One notable incident saw a designer's grandfather, who lived in Japan, pass away during production. The designer flew to Japan for the funeral, which apparently infuriated a higher up at THQ. More importantly, THQ was said to be extremely slow at paying Big Sky, resulting in numerous times where they were cutting it close to not being able to pay employees. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, THQ COO Jeff Lappin offered Big Sky the chance to be purchased by THQ. Big Sky considered this, but turned down the offer, having just been burned by not having freedom and independence. Development on both Jimmy Neutron and SpongeBob was starting to reach the home stretch, so naturally Big Sky started looking to the future. They'd begun building partnerships with other companies to secure their future beyond 2002. However, all of a sudden they started receiving radio silence from these companies. Without securing funding from these partnerships for future games, the studio's financial situation nosedived, resulting in the final days of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman's development being rife with layoffs. Once Flying Dutchman was out the door, Big Sky ceased to exist. Being unable to secure funding for their next game killed the company. But why did they all of a sudden lose contact with these companies they'd been talking to? Well, the hearsay from people who apparently worked with Jeff Lappin claim that he blacklisted Big Sky. Now, in the video I mentioned earlier that covers this, the blacklisting of Big Sky makes it seem like Lappin had the ability to go to some magical, literal blacklist, write Big Sky's name on it, and then automatically every company in the world had to stop working with Big Sky. No, that's not exactly how this works. The likely scenario is this: Lappin, and probably other THQ higher-ups too, were unhappy with Revenge of the Flying Dutchman's turbulent development. This probably resulted in those higher-ups talking shit about Big Sky, giving them a poor reputation, which would quickly pass around in the industry. It also wouldn't surprise me if some of the companies Big Sky had been talking to reached out directly to THQ to find out what they were like. Lappin was COO during arguably THQ's most financially successful period, so naturally other people in the industry would probably take his word when it came to things like this. Could Lappin be the reason nobody wanted to work with Big Sky? Possibly. Could Lappin directly force everybody to stop working with them? Absolutely not. I also think the fact that Big Sky's Jimmy Neutron game was an irredeemable piece of garbage probably hurt their chances of finding another partner. So yeah, that's the story of Big Sky. Critically, scores for the console version of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman were all over the place. The average for the PS2 version was a 5.3, but the GameCube version was a 7.2. I think this is largely because of the infamous loading screen glitch on the PS2, which also had a chance to corrupt your save data. Outside of that, there's no real reason for the scores to be so different. On the other hand, you had the GBA version, which was getting scores in the mid-7s. If we ignore the PS2 version, the GameCube and GBA versions are ranked as one of the most well-received Nickelodeon games of all time, putting it in a similar category to Battle For Bikini Bottom and the game based on the first movie. With all of that said, let's dive down to Bikini Bottom to check out both of these games. As has been the trend with Nickelodeon, this 2D platformer has a couple of difficulty modes. I've never been brave enough to pick the hard mode, but I do wonder what it does to make the experience tougher here. You're given a tutorial mode right off the bat to get you accustomed to everything, and also to set up the game's minimal story. Basically, Gary runs away and you end up finding the Flying Dutchman, and then he tells you to go find his treasures. Not really much revenge going on here. As far as the gameplay goes, it's a pretty standard 2D platformer. You've got coins to collect in each level, which if you grab every single one of them, you get a bonus level that allows you to win 1-ups. And of course, because this is a Nickelodeon 2D platformer, there has to be some extra objective bullshit, rather than make a straightforward A to B platformer. Here you have to find 3 keys in every level to unlock the treasure at the end. Every damn Nickelodeon game. Can I just get one normal platformer? Throw me a bone here. The initial couple of levels are pretty simple. You'll almost trip over each of the keys on your way to the end goal. However, from as early as the 3rd level, you'll start missing them and have to backtrack. It's just painful. The experience could have been a lot worse though, because the overall controls in Revenge of the Flying Dutchman are solid. Platforming is tight enough to handle the jumps set up in this game, and SpongeBob has a weird sort of glide you can utilize where he inflates himself like a balloon. There's the disturbing crawl move from SpongeBob too. I think the biggest issue with traversal early on is that SpongeBob's movement speed is too slow. For the first few levels, you're just walking around. Eventually, after a rather dull encounter with Plankton where you have to stop him from stealing Krabby Patties, you gain the ability to run, which pretty much solves this issue. In a similar manner to Hey Arnold the movie, this game is also much more focused on combat than platforming challenges. The main mechanic of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is SpongeBob's bubble blowing. At first, this is used purely to trap jellyfish floating around levels, which can then be used as platforms. Very quickly, it evolves into something much more though. You'll get different types of bubbles that will float you upwards or give you a bounce, that don't require you to trap an innocent sea creature. Also, there are the strong bubbles, which allow you to kill innocent sea creatures. Bit of a double-edged sword here with the powers. These bubbles will help you navigate each level, and the concept is pretty cool. But it's held back by a pretty big flaw in my opinion. Instead of SpongeBob having a constantly present arsenal of moves you can cycle through, the game just dictates what powers you have. You can only have one power at a time, with the game almost forcing you to change powers based on where you are in a level. I think it's a massive missed opportunity to not let players switch powers on the fly. Particularly in later levels, the traversal challenges to find keys feel like they have multiple solutions to them. Like they were designed to have players pick whatever power they thought would get them to the goal easiest. Building the game around this would have worked so much better, and also eliminate the multiple times where I accidentally grabbed the wrong bubble ability, locking me out of the chance to actually progress. This one simple sliding doors moment genuinely makes the game so much worse in my eyes. On a positive note, checkpointing here is really solid, which is a necessity when some levels will take you like 45 minutes to complete. Honestly, after the first couple of levels, this game becomes a chore to play. The third level is designed to be the most annoying thing possible, with projectiles and enemies being launched at you constantly. Then you arrive at the ice level, which might be the most frustrating and least enjoyable 2D platformer level I have ever experienced. It's a slog to go through with the constant slipping, it's ridiculously long, and to make matters worse, they introduce a wind mechanic that is constantly blowing SpongeBob around. It's like Vicarious Visions set out to make the most tedious level possible. And of course, I'd be doing this game an injustice if I didn't mention the boss battles. It wouldn't be a Nickelodeon game without randomly shoehorned in boss battles.
Daring today, aren't we?
Presentation wise, I don't like Revenge of the Flying Dutchman on GBA. It has a kind of ugly style and some very weird issues. Take Mr. Krabs for example. What's wrong with his nose? It's a completely different shade to the rest of his body. Did nobody look at this and see an issue? Revenge of the Flying Dutchman on the GBA is a tedious experience. The fundamental process of playing through levels just isn't fun. With the way things are set up, it often feels like the world's shittiest Metroidvania, with players constantly having to backtrack and grab different bubble powers. It's quite similar to how I felt about Hey Arnold the movie, in all honesty, except that game felt like it had the structure and DNA to be a really fun, straightforward platformer, which isn't really the case here. I just want a normal Nickelodeon platformer. No strange objectives or half-hearted attempts to dabble in different genres, just make Super Mario Bros. With a Nickelodeon skin. There are ways Revenge of the Flying Dutchman could have been a success though. Throw away all the key collecting rubbish, make the levels linear outside of secret bonus areas that aren't a requirement to find, and then give me access to all of the bubble powers with the freedom to decide how I want to get from start to finish. Make those changes and I could see myself really enjoying this. I couldn't disagree more with the reviews for this game. This is nowhere near the upper echelon of Nickelodeon games with how much of a chore it is to play. Well, let's see if the console version can somehow be enjoyable despite its turbulent development.
There's something written on it. I think it says, Damjer, Donut Alpine, Orelsi. I wonder what that means.
One thing I found quite interesting is that the home console and GBA versions of Revenge of the Flying Dutchman aren't all that similar. They both have the Flying Dutchman appear and have a treasure collecting motif, but outside of that, they're not too similar. There was some connectivity planned between the GBA and GameCube versions, but that really wouldn't have made them any more similar. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman's narrative is much more high stakes on home consoles. Gary accidentally digs up the Flying Dutchman's treasure, which leads to SpongeBob releasing the ghost pirate from his slumber. The Dutchman then takes Gary, and eventually all of your friends, to be part of his ghostly crew. It's up to SpongeBob to save the day. I have to say, the writing in this game is fantastic. Playing through this story, it honestly wouldn't have felt out of place as an episode in the show's golden era.
Avast, matey! Who goes there? Be ye here to steal my booty?
Oh, believe me, I have no interest in touching your booty. I just want to find my friends and get them home.
Apparently some fans dislike this game because it doesn't feel the same as the show when it comes to tone and writing, but I couldn't disagree more, this is spot on. You don't really experience the story through cutscenes. The cutscenes here are all static, with still characters repeating canned animations while a conversation happens. Even with this low budget option, the writing is strong enough to have you listening to everything the characters have to say.
I love visiting Sandy in her tree dome. Where else in Bikini Bottom can you worry about dying from all this air?
The goal is for SpongeBob to find all of the Dutchman's treasure, which will somehow allow him to free his friends. In each level, you'll find letters that spell out SpongeBob. Grabbing all of these takes you to a timed tile puzzle, and completing that then takes you to a treasure hunting portion. Getting the SpongeBob letters is a varied task. Often you'll just have to platform to a certain section of the level, but then there are letters that are obtained through more unique activities and events. Maybe you'll be delivering food for Mr. Krabs, or maybe you'll have to play golf. The other thing to do in this game is to collect gold doubloons and catch jellyfish. This initially seems like just a typical 3D collectathon platformer thing that you do for 100%, but basically every level will ask you to collect and catch a certain number to obtain a letter. There's also times where you have to pay people off with a required number of those items to progress, so in general it's a good idea to not neglect these seemingly optional aspects. SpongeBob's journey takes him to 7 different levels. You'll start in Bikini Bottom and end up heading to Downtown, Sandy's Tree Dome, Jellyfish Fields, Chum World, Goo Lagoon, and then the Flying Dutchman's lair. The levels are relatively small for the most part, with Jellyfish Fields feeling like the odd one out. Personally, I felt like Jellyfish Fields was almost a prototype Battle for Bikini Bottom level with the way it was laid out and structured. Standard controls like movement and jumping are passable for this era of 3D platformers. It's no Ratchet and Clank, but it gets the job done. My one big issue is that SpongeBob's shadow has a habit of disappearing at the worst times when you're making tough jumps. Not being able to accurately tell where SpongeBob will land resulted in a lot of deaths. Like Ratchet and Clank's unique hook of having a crazy arsenal of weapons, Revenge of the Flying Dutchman has a decent twist on its gameplay. Littered throughout Bikini Bottom are these costume tents. As you play, you'll unlock 3 different costumes, each of which has a new ability. The first and easily the most often used is the jellyfishing costume. I would hazard a guess that I used this costume for like 90% of the game, largely because catching jellyfish is such a prevalent part. Other than that, this costume also allows you to hang onto fishing hooks, which plays a role in traversal during some levels. There's the Mermaid Man costume, which was pretty much pointless. You can throw water balls that are necessary pretty much once, so outside of that I never found a point in putting it on. Lastly, there's the Reef Blower. This is used to move certain objects and blow pinwheels. It's unlocked super late in the game, and it actually forces you to return to some earlier levels because there are letters you can only grab once you have it. Overall, it's a solid-ish system. I think a less turbulent development could have allowed the costumes to be better utilised though. As it stands, it's pretty much the jellyfishing game. Camera controls could have used some tweaking too, but like most things in this game, it's passable and not a massive hindrance. That's really a consistent theme for Revenge of the Flying Dutchman on home consoles. My negatives generally don't harm the overall experience too much. The DNA of the game is solid. One of my most hated moments was the reef-blowing golf game I mentioned earlier. The physics do not function well here. Just watch me try and push this ball up a ramp to get to the final checkpoints. The Goo Lagoon level kinda sucks from top to bottom too, and then naturally, this game had to shoehorn a boss battle in before it could conclude. You literally go the entire way without so much as sniffing boss battle style gameplay, and then bam, the game has to end with an out of character boss battle. The presentation is a mixed bag like the rest of the game. It gets a big tick for having the entire voice cast here. Even Mr. Krabs has the correct voice. There's just one notable exception. For some reason, Tom Kenny, the goddamn voice of SpongeBob, isn't the voice of the French narrator like he usually is.
Man.
You don't understand. The book you borrowed from Squidward was not completely accurate. In fact, it was a little out of date.
Uh-oh.
This seems bizarre. Like, Tom Kenny is already here voicing the main character. Why isn't he also doing this role? I can only assume this must have been a money thing. I can't think of any other reason why he wouldn't do it. It's pretty cool to see Bikini Bottom brought to life in 3D for the first time, with the majority of the iconic locations from the show on display here. And where else could you get to experience SpongeBob taking a piss? Apparently you can also make him shit too. Revenge of the Flying Dutchman is just dripping in early 3D platformer jank. Just look at Larry or these Chumworld clowns running away after cutscenes.
Hey, don't you want to take your shoes off before you go swimming? Professor? Oh.
One of the strangest design decisions in the entire game centers around the music. Instead of having the music change based on your location, the game's music changes based on what costume you're wearing. There are a couple of levels that are exceptions to this rule, but for the most part, that's how the game's soundtrack works. On paper, this seems kind of cool, especially if they had really fleshed out the costume system. Instead, it really falls flat. Like I said earlier, 90% of the game is you in the jellyfishing outfit, so that's basically all you'll be hearing. Honestly, I like Revenge of the Flying Dutchman on home consoles. It's a fun little 3D platformer. Yeah, it's not as good as Battle for Bikini Bottom, but you can see so much of its DNA present here. It's clear as day that Revenge of the Flying Dutchman was the inspiration for that iconic game. I just can't disagree more with some of the critical reception for the game. In particular, I want to highlight the IGN review by Mark Ryan, which uses several ableist slurs to put down the game. Even in 2002, this shit wasn't cool, you fucking edgelord. Also, the only technical issues I had on the GameCube version was a glitch at the pressure plate section in the downtown level, which was thankfully resolved by exiting and entering the level again. For a game with such a turbulent development, having no glitches outside of the PS2 load glitch that tanked that version's score is pretty good. On the flip side, I really didn't enjoy the handheld release. If they'd completely refocused the game on different aspects rather than being some poor attempt at a Metroidvania, maybe I would have been high on it too. Next time I'll be looking at another double feature. Get used to it because a lot of Nick games do this until like 2012. Rocket Power has had an up and down run so far, with a couple of lackluster releases and one solid game that was super weird. This time we'll be looking at Beach Bandits on handheld and home consoles. To make sure you catch that review and the impending review of Nickelodeon Party Blast, make sure you're subscribed.